Could you survive without washing, without rest, perpetually hungry, and under the shadow of death each day? A medieval peasant's life was a silent battlefield in which the enemy was everyday existence itself. Forget kings and knights, for the Middle Ages were lived with feet in the mud, hands hardened by toil, and eyes ever turned to the sky, praying for good harvests and for divine mercy. In this video, we will venture into the dusty fields and wretched villages where millions fought simply to exist. We will learn about their customs, their fears, their rituals, and their punishments. You will discover why the harsh life of the peasant was in fact the backbone of all feudal Europe. Prepare for an immersive journey through a forgotten world. And yes, you probably would not last 24 hours there. At dawn in a medieval village, the day was not merely beginning. It was the renewal of an ancestral burden. Before the sun had fully risen above the misty horizon, the peasants were already on their feet. There were no luxuries or time for contemplation. Survival was a constant task governed by the rhythms of nature and by the demands of the feudal lord, whose authority extended over land, bodies, and destinies. Most peasants were serfs tied to the land. Unlike slaves, they could not be sold individually. They remained bound to the soil they cultivated, and that land, of course, belonged to the lord. This relationship of dependence meant their lives were a continuous negotiation between sweat and fear. Their payment for dwelling on and working the land came in the form of heavy dues, a share of the harvest, forced labor on the lord's own, fields, and taxes that were almost always arbitrary. Agricultural routines followed the seasons. In spring, it was time to plow and sow. In summer came maintenance and care. Autumn brought the harvest, the most eagerly awaited season since it determined whether there would be bread for the winter. In winter, the fields lay dormant, yet suffering intensified. It was the season of biting cold, of hunger, of disease, and often of death. All work was carried out with rudimentary tools: plows drawn by oxen, worn sickles, and hoes with wooden handles. Labor was strenuous and unremitting, with no guarantees. A drought, a storm, or a plague of rats could reduce months of effort to dust. Most families lived on the brink of destitution, subsisting on oat porridge, dark bread, and, on special occasions, a little cheese or salted meat. Peasant homes were huts of wood or wattle and daub, roofed with straw, and consisting of a single room serving as kitchen, bedroom, and stable. There, men, women, children, and livestock slept under the same roof. The floor was beaten earth, the fire burned at the center of the room with no chimney, and smoke permeated everything, from eyes to clothing to lungs. Yet that smoke kept pests at bay and preserved the roof, a cruel irony that encapsulates peasant life. Survival before comfort. But there was more than work and poverty. Life was enmeshed in a web of beliefs and superstitions that gave meaning to suffering. The harvest was preceded by rituals, blessings, and omens in the sky. Religion dominated the peasants' worldview not by choice, but by necessity. The promise of eternal salvation was their consolation against the brutal reality of existence. The Catholic Church, with its monks, priests, and bishops, was ever present. Every sin could lead to damnation, and each indulgence came at a high price, both in faith and in resources. The church bell marked time and the village's rhythm. It summoned people to Mass, announced the arrival of tax collectors, and told at funerals, which were frequent since life expectancy was very low. Many died before the age of 35, felled by infections, malnutrition, or complications in childbirth. Yet there were moments of celebration. Religious festivals such as Christmas, Easter, or the Harvest Festival brought diluted wine, simple dances, and stories told by torchlight. They were fleeting pauses in a life of continuous toil, but deeply human nonetheless. In this somber setting, the resilience of the peasants is remarkable. Not out of heroism, but out of necessity. They had no choice, for the alternative to struggle was death. And still, day after day, generation after generation, they endured. Thanks to them, kingdoms flourished, towns arose, and nobles could wage war. If exhausting labor marked the peasants' bodies, constant fear shaped their souls. To live in the Middle Ages was above all to walk beneath the shadow of punishment, divine, feudal, or communal. Any transgression, however small, could result in exclusion, suffering, or death. Hardship was not only in the fields, but in the institutions that governed every step of life. Beyond the feudal lord who demanded loyalty and ceaseless labor stood the priest. He not only conducted religious rites, but also watched over the community's behavior. Christian morality dictated all aspects of life, from what could be eaten during Lent to whom one might marry. Sin was not merely a spiritual fault, but a social threat. An adulterous woman could be expelled from the village, and a man accused of blasphemy might be whipped in the public square, all with the approval, or at least the acquiescence of neighbors. Justice was often arbitrary. In many regions, lords held the so-called right of the gallows, meaning they could condemn a serf to death for crimes deemed serious, which might include theft of food, desertion, or direct disobedience. Punishments were exemplary: floggings, mutilations, and hangings. They served less to penalize the individual than to terrorize the collective. Fear was a tool of control. There was also fear of the invisible. Disease, plague, drought, and storms were seen as signs of divine wrath or demonic presence. A harsher winter might be blamed on witchcraft, and older or isolated women could be accused without evidence, subjected to torture, and executed. Ignorance was fertile ground for superstition. Stone circles were avoided, ancient trees were thought to house spirits, and certain herbs were used in rituals blending Christianity with ancestral paganism. Many peasants believed that the dead could return. Ghosts of suicides, of those unburied, or of victims of murder were said to wander the paths between villages. It was common to leave offerings at crossroads or at the forest's edge in an attempt to appease these presences. Ancient Celtic and Germanic traditions, despite the church's efforts, still echoed in whispered corners and in symbols carved on barn doors. The forest itself, so near and yet so hostile, was both a source of food and of fear. Wood, game, and fruit could be gathered, but often not freely. Many woods belonged to the lord or the king, and peasants caught hunting illegally risked imprisonment or death. The forest was also home to bandits, wolves, and, in legend, mythical creatures. Treacherous fairies, beast men, and spirits that abducted children all inhabited the medieval imagination. War was another ever-present specter. When feudal lords clashed, their lands became battlefields. Peasants were the first to suffer. Their crops pillaged, their huts burnt, and their families enslaved or slain without ceremony. Many men were forced to fight untrained, only to be cut down by superior steel. Even in rare times of peace, taxes never ceased. There was the tithe for the church, the banalities owed to the Lord for use of ovens, mills, and presses, and additional levies on marriages, births, and inheritances. Living was costly, but dying was no less so. Hunger was a silent companion. Years of poor harvest did not merely mean scarcity, but catastrophe. desperate peasants resorted to tree bark, bitter herb soup, and in extreme cases, there are accounts of cannibalism. Death by starvation was common and often accompanied by epidemics that found ideal conditions among weak bodies and crowded dwellings. Hope, when it existed, came from above. Life was but a trial. True relief would come only after. Death, if the peasant managed to escape hell, purgatory, or the eternal punishments reserved for sinners. Faith was both a solace and an invisible prison that kept people obedient, resigned, and above all, fearful. To be a peasant in the Middle Ages meant living at the margins of power, with no political voice, no formal education, and extremely limited freedom. Yet contrary to the image of passivity often associated with these men and women, rural medieval life also contained subtle and sometimes surprising forms of resistance, popular creativity, and even pleasure. The peasant's first and most powerful weapon was community. In a world where the state was distant and the church often complicit in feudal oppression, bonds between neighbors, families, and entire villages formed a network of mutual protection. The land might belong to the Lord, but knowledge of it, best times for planting, the cycles of the harvest, and the secrets of fertilization, was the peasant's domain. This wisdom passed down orally was essential for collective survival. At seasonal festivals, peasants found respite. Many of these Christian celebrations were in fact adaptations of pagan rituals, dating back to times before Europe was Christianized. Summer solstice, harvests, and the arrival of spring all provided reasons for villagers to gather, dance, sing, and for a few hours forget the weight of the feudal yoke. At these festivities, diluted wine and mead flowed, songs were sung in local tongues, and storytellers became popular chroniclers, weaving tales of peasant heroes outwitting lords, dragons, and priests with cunning and humor. Oral tradition was the peasant's true book. Without access to written texts, they transmitted knowledge through songs, proverbs, and stories. Many medieval myths originate from gatherings around the peasant hearth. It was there that tales of werewolves, witches, wandering knights, and enchanted woods were born. Narratives reflecting the common folk's fears and desires in contrast to the noble epic. Music also held a central place in this world. Simple instruments such as bone flutes, animal skin drums, and small lutes were played at celebrations and ceremonies. Songs recounted love's misfortunes, laments for injustice, and even satirical jabs at the powerful. In many regions, certain melodies were passed from generation to generation, almost like secret anthems of peasant identity. There was humor, too. Despite the harshness of existence, peasants found ways to laugh at fate, authority, and their own misfortune. Stories of gluttonous priests, duped lords, and ridiculous trials circulated as a means of relieving tension and at the same time subverting the established order. Laughter was a small act of rebellion. Resistance could also be direct. Uprisings broke out across medieval Europe. One of the most famous was the English Peasants' Revolt of 1381, when thousands marched on London demanding an end to oppressive taxes and better living conditions. Although the revolt was crushed, with violence it sent a clear message that oppression had its limits. Elsewhere in France, Germany, and the Iberian kingdoms, smaller revolts and silent sabotage showed that peasants were not just victims, but sometimes protagonists of their own history. At home, life continued amid childcare, teachings passed on by grandmothers, and small inventions to ease daily chores alongside protective beliefs. Amulets were worn, secret prayers murmured at bedtime, and certain objects, twigs from particular trees or oddly shaped stones, were kept as talismans against disease and bad luck. Healers, often marginalized by the church, were respected by peasants. Their remedies of herbs, roots, and ancient prayers kept alive practices mixing primitive medicine with ancestral mysticism. This knowledge survived away from books, but with remarkable resilience. In the end, peasants did not live merely to serve. They created, celebrated, and fought, and in their own way left a profound, though invisible, legacy. Popular European culture, local dialects, rustic gastronomy, fairy tales, proverbs, and even some modern festivals trace their roots to medieval villages and fields. Despite being crushed by the feudal system, peasants resisted not only with arms or revolts, but through memory, culture, and faith. Through this immersion in medieval peasant life, we have revealed a world where suffering was the norm, not the exception. A world shaped by the land, by faith, by fear, and by the brute force of feudal structures. We saw how bodies were subjected to exhaustion, how souls were pressed by guilt and sin, and how even the silence of night carried ancestral terrors. Yet we also witnessed something beyond pain, a surprising capacity for endurance. These men and women, often overlooked by grand histories, sustained empires with their calloused hands. Their lives were short, their voices muted, but their presence was decisive. They fed armies, supported churches, and built entire villages through collective effort. Even under the harshest conditions, they cultivated rituals, myths, music, and ways of seeing the world that still survive in diluted form in today's popular imagination. The rigidity of medieval hierarchies may seem distant, but in many respects, the logic of oppression and inequality endures. Even now, millions labor under unjust systems, trapped in cycles of exploitation and despair. Medieval peasants remind us that human dignity does not depend on luxury, but on the struggle, silent or loud, for survival and recognition. And you? Do you still think you would survive a day in that reality? Perhaps not. But perhaps the real challenge is not living as they did, but recognizing how much the modern world is still built upon the suffering and the strength of those who work unseen.